What's going on, everyone? It's Elias here at the Rainy Forge with another video. This being the first video in a new series I'm doing, which is going to be all about tips and tricks for knife making, woodworking, leatherworking, handle making, you name it, anything I do here at the Forge. Just a few tips and tricks I've learned over the years to share with you guys making stuff at home. So let's get started. So for the first video in this series, we're going to be doing some Damascus. Now, for any of you who are not aware, Damascus just means pattern welded. So technically, you could have a Damascus steel blade, which can be considered Damascus, made out of all mild weldable steel that does not hold an edge. In fact, most of the times, if you find a Damascus knife online for less than, say, 60 bucks, chances are it's fake. And if you are paying 60 bucks for it, unless it's very small, chances are it's made out of garbage steel that is not going to hold an edge very well. It might be still made out of high carbon steel, but it probably hasn't been tempered or heat treated properly and won't hold an edge very well. I don't know why, but there is a huge industry of people over in Pakistan and Taiwan and China, obviously, that do a lot of mass-produced Damascus that is crap. So you have to be very careful what you're buying and make sure that you're buying stuff from either someone in America or someone who has good reviews, makes good quality. Now, I have before me a Damascus billet that I bought offline. So this is kind of your typical Pakistani Damascus. This is what you're gonna get when you order Damascus off a mass production website. I get this from Spark and Blades over on Etsy. They're a pretty good store. I've ordered a lot of stuff from them. I've been happy with 99% of the stuff I've gotten. And so I buy these Damascus billets from them. Now, these are very, very basic, and as you can see, there's a lot of pattern. They're about 100 layer Damascus. And this is called a ladder pattern Damascus when it's got like the lines like that. And all the different patterns of Damascus that you have are made in many different ways. Ladder pattern, since that's what we're looking at here, is usually done with the cross on a cross peen hammer, and I'll show you that later in the video. And you just kind of hammer in a ladder pattern, or you can go to a grinder and grind in lines and make like a ladder pattern, and then everything gets flattened out, and that kind of creates this ladder pattern. So this stuff is good. I've used it before, even though it's from Pakistan, I believe. It is good steel. It can heat treat well, and it is made out of 1095 and 15 and 20, which are usually the go-to steels. You can also use 1084 and 15 and 20, but you always have to have 15 and 20 if you want a really nice high carbon steel Damascus, because 15 and 20 has nickel in it. And what that nickel does is it gives your steel a little bit of resistance to your ferric chloride when you go to acid etch it, and we'll talk about that later. And also when we stick it in our instant coffee bath, which I will also talk about later, and that leaves your steel nice and shiny, the 15 and 20. But it blackens your 1095 or your 1084, which have more carbon in them. So, what are we going to do here? And if you're going to make something like your 100 layer Damascus, you really, really need a power hammer. Otherwise, it is a lot of hand hammering and folding steel over, and it sucks. But back in the day, what did they do when power hammers didn't exist? Back in Imperial Japan, for example, myself being a quarter Okinawan, I do a lot of Japanese knives. Of course, you've seen my videos, you've seen Hamon lines are kind of my thing. That's kind of what I do. But I also do a lot of Japanese style knives and whatnot. And since we're doing Damascus today, we're going to talk about doing Sanmai and Gomai Damascus. Now again, Damascus means pattern welded. In this case, we're going to be using some, traditional Damascus, what people think of as Damascus. But Damascus just means pattern welded steel. So a Sanmai or a Gomai blade, which looks something like this, is also technically Damascus because we are forge welding steel together. Now, I cheat a little bit, and I do a Sanmai or a Gomai Damascus whenever I make Damascus blades. And then I'll either fold my billet over to make a few more layers, getting it up to about 12 to 15 layers usually. And I will also do what we are doing today because I find this to be boring. It looks like TV static in my opinion. It's very busy, there's too much going on, and when you see it from afar, you look at it and you're like, oh, that's cool, but it kind of looks like every single Damascus blade that I've ever seen on the internet. And yeah, I don't feel like paying 150, 160, 200 bucks for that knife. So let's make something pretty. So Sanmai, Gomai, what does that mean? Well, Sanmai means 3-layer in Japan. San being 3, Mai being layer. Therefore, Gomai means 5-layer. Ichi ni sansei go roku shichi hachi kuju. Now, what I like to do here at the Ready Forge, since I don't have a power hammer, is do a Sanmai or a Gomai billet with some of this Damascus. And what that does is it actually stretches out that pattern in the forging process, which makes things look a little bit more interesting and a little bit less like TV static. And on top of that, it puts this really awesome accent of Damascus just in the center of the blade and a little squiggle line that looks absolutely phenomenal, and you ain't gonna see it pretty much anywhere else. So, what we gotta do to get started is we're going to cut up this Damascus billet into smaller chunks to match our, let's go with our 15 and 20. And then we are going to clean everything up as good as we possibly can, because dirty steel will not forge weld. You will get inclusions and delams and all sorts of other fun stuff that we'll talk about later as we go into forging. But for now, let's start. We'll chop the steel up and then clean it up nice and pretty. Alright, so I've got my 2 chunks of Damascus, and I've got 3 chunks of 15 and 20 to make my Gomai billet, again, 5-layer. So we're going to be stacking these and welding everything together into a nice little billet. So make my stack like that, and we'll go over to my welder and tack weld everything together, and also weld a handle on so I have something to hold on to so I can put this deep in my forge and get everything nice and uniform heat before I hammer it down to make sure I get a successful forge weld. And we'll talk more about temperatures and forge welding in a second. But the other thing I wanted to share with you guys real quick, if you're doing a Sanmai, Gomai, or any kind of a Damascus billet with a sandwich, if you're using your 2 different types of steels that are the same thickness, once you grind them down, you can't tell what's what. And the last thing you want to do is make a mistake and stack 2 of the same steel together instead of that intermediate layer there, so that when you go to hammer everything out and forge weld together and you acid etch it, it looks terrible because you accidentally put 2 of the same steel next to each other and completely ruined your billet. So a little trick for you guys that I do, because I've made that mistake before in the past, is if you have all of your steel as a uniform thickness, when you're going through and doing, say, your 15 and 20, just take your grinder and grind down a corner, and that will allow you to know when looking at them what's your 15 and 20 and what's your 1095. Just a little trick for you guys, it works great. If you try and use marker to mark what's what, you run into the risk of having dirty steel and not getting a good forge weld. So you want to make sure everything's nice and clean, and just grind a little corner so you know what's what as you're going, so that if something happens and uh-oh, I dropped my steel, what's what? Okay, that's my 1520, that's my 1095, I can restack and be fine. So let's jump out and get everything welded together. Alright, so what we're going to do here is we're going to weld up this corner here, and then our back corner. Then we're going to weld the handle on the side here, and then flip it and do the same thing on the other side. When I weld my handle on here, what you want to make sure you do when you're welding on the side, is start at the bottom and work up, so that your hot slag doesn't fall down and get in the way of your weld. That'll do it. So now that we got our billet welded up, we want to make sure that this stays clean on the inside. Now there's two ways to do that. You can either throw this right into the forge, get it hot, and throw some flux on there, or you can dip it in kerosene or spray it down with WD-40. Now I don't have kerosene, I don't have a place I can get a bucket of kerosene, so I've just got WD-40 and this stuff works great. You just want to spray your billet down. Make sure you get those cracks on both sides, the front and the back. And capillary action will pull the fluid into the center of the billet and keep everything nice and clean. Now we can go ahead and start our forge, get that stuck in there, heat it up nice and hot, and get our first hammer in to set that weld. So while I'm forging, you're going to see me put a white powder on my steel. What I'm using here is just borax. You can get this at the dollar store or Walmart. And what this does is it's a flux. It keeps your steel clean when it gets too cool and helps prevent forge scale from building up on the steel, which would prevent you from being able to get a nice, good, clean forge weld. Now, you want to make sure that you use a decent amount, but not too much, because if you use too much flux and it gets into your billet and you have no way of hammering it out of the billet, it will stay in the billet and give you a cold shut, which is not good. And when we're grinding and you get to that cold shut, it makes a risk for the steel to split back open and that forge weld to separate. So, as you see me working this steel and putting some white powder on it, this is what I'm using. It's a flux. Keeps things nice and clean in case my steel gets too cool. So once you got your billet nice and hot, you want to make sure you hit it while it's hot. And those first few hits are critical. Those are kind of setting your welds. So now we'll put our flux on there. And immediately back into the forge. Now it's best to do forge welding on a nice dark rainy day like today, so you can really see the color of your steel. Make sure you're not getting it too hot. As soon as your steel starts to get sparky, and you'll see that in the fire, it's too hot. You've burned your steel there's a very, very minimal chance that you're going to get a good forge weld at that point. So the best thing to do is to take it out completely, let it cool down, clean it up, and try again. So now that I have my forge weld set, so you can see those sparks, that means the steel is a little bit too hot. That's okay, because I've already set my forge weld, and I don't have to worry about oxidization. So now I'm going to go over to the horn of the anvil, start hitting the side. Just start drawing our billet out. Make sure we flatten it. And then I'm just going to take a wire brush here, throw a bunch of stuff, but get a wire brush here. We're just going to clean off any forge scale that's built up. A little bit more flux, just in case. Not much, just a little bit. Keep things nice and clean. I'm back in the forge. Alright, so I've got my billet drawn out. I'm going to be ending up forging a chef's knife with this billet. But I need it a little bit flatter, a little bit wider. And the way that we're going to do that is with the cross on my cross-peen hammer. And it's very important that you do this when you're doing a sand-by or a go-by billet, not only to draw out your steel, but it also puts a pattern in that Damascus. As I'll show you when we go to grind and acid etch, we get a nice little squiggle along our blade instead of just a straight line. We want to keep our steel hot, so back in the forge. Once you do your ridges, make sure you flatten everything. Nice and clean. Now it's very important when you're doing a sand-by or a go-my billet, you do not hammer in your bevel. I repeat, do not hammer in your bevel. And I'll show you in a little bit what happens when you hammer in your bevel, but I'm saying it now, do not hammer in your bevel. You're going to grind it in. So I'm going to finish shaping this knife, and I'll get right back with you. So here's the knife, forged out. I'm going to go ahead and grind the final shape and clean it up a bit, and I will get back to you once we are at a 400 grit and then a nice polish. Alright, so real quick before I get to the heat treat, and we do bring it to 400 and then polish it, I wanted to show you the knife. I decided instead of a chef knife, we're just going to go with like a hunting, camping, everyday carry sort of a Tonto here. The spine's a little bit thick for me for a chef's knife, and I really didn't want to get rid of this beautiful forged texture in here. There's just some really, really cool stuff going on that I wanted to keep. But we still have that really nice tall bevel where we can really show off the Damascus and the acid etch, which I'll show you in a little bit. I went ahead and made up a little guard for the knife here. Put a nice little hammer pattern on there as well, so that'll look really, really cool. And then I'm just going to do a resin pour with some wood and make a handle that kind of looks like this. But I just wanted to show that to you guys real quick, keep you posted on what I'm doing here with this knife. And I'm going to go ahead and heat treat this and clean it up. Again, bring it to that 400 and then a polish, and we'll get into some acid etching. Alright, so I wanted to demonstrate to you guys what's going on with our Go My billet when I'm hammering it and forging it, and talk mainly about why we don't hammer in a bevel when we're working on a San Mai or a Go My billet. So here I have some clay, and this is to mock our steel. The red will be our Damascus, and the white will be our 15 and 20. So we make our little sandwich, just like we did with our steel. And then of course, instead of welding it, we're just going to push it together here. And that's going to be our, our forge weld. And as you can see on the side, we have our nice layering going on here. And in fact, I'm going to take a little knife and clean this up so we can really see what's going on here. Alright, so there's our very clear 3 layers, or 5 layers, excuse me, of clay. Now, the first thing is, if you were to hammer this billet out, nice and flat, get it to the right thickness you wanted, and then just go ahead and grind that bevel on there, you would have kind of fairly straight lines going on with your middle steel there. And although that looks cool, we want it to look a little bit cooler, and that is why we use the cross on the crossbeam hammer. So now, move my coffee, if I go ahead and hit this, make sure you do the same thing on the other side. So now, as you can see, we've got a wave going on in there. So now if you, in the normal forging process, we're just to flatten our billet out nice. And then you were to go over on the grinder, and I will use my little knife here instead of the grinder. But same general principle here. So if you were to go and grind your steel, you'd have this really nice, cool, wavy line. In fact, if I do this properly, and, grind both sides, you have your really nice centerpiece with your Damascus, or just your, straight 15 and 20 or straight 1095, whatever you wanted to be doing. Or if you wanted to put some copper or some nickel in there to give you a bit of an accent, that's basically what you'd have going on. Now, what happens if we hammer out our bevel instead of just grinding it from a nice flat billet? Well, as you can see already, what happens is we kind of smash everything flat, and we lose that really nice layer that we have on the other side. So now if you were to take your grinder and remove some material, as you can see, we can still see our layer, but it's pinched really, really tight to the edge of the steel. And you're going to lose 90% of that pattern when you go and put your final edge on there. And again, that is why we never, ever, ever want to hammer out our bevel when we're doing a San Mai or a Go My billet, so that when we go to grind it, we get that nice pattern throughout. Now I'll show you kind of how that looks on the steel, and we'll do the acid etch. Alright, so here's the knife, all nice and polished and shiny. And now it's very important before you dip a knife in ferric chloride that you clean it very well, make sure there's no bits of grease or anything on the blade. Many times I've been an idiot and not cleaned my blades properly, and there's been a little thumbprint on there, fingerprint on there, and I dip it in the acid, and when I pull it out, that thumbprint or fingerprint has actually been etched into the steel, which is always lovely and looks phenomenal. So make sure you don't do that. So just take a clean cloth, just wipe it down, make sure there's nothing on there. And then for Damascus, we're going to dip it in our ferric chloride for 20 seconds. And then you can just start to see that beautiful Damascus pattern starting on there. Let this drip for a second so I don't get acid everywhere. I try to not get this stuff on my hands, but it's not the worst, and we're going to be washing this off anyway, so just put a little bit on my finger here. But if my camera will adjust here, you can see that beautiful Damascus pattern just starting. So now I'm going to wash all this acid off the knife, and we're going to rub it down with some heavy-duty rubbing compound to clean any oxides off and get her nice and shiny and polished again. So as you've seen me use before, I have my number 7 heavy-duty rubbing compound, and just take a little bit of abrasive cloth and just clean all those oxides off the knife here. So in this billet we used 15 and 20, and in this case with that 15 and 20, if done properly, it will remain nice and shiny when we do our second acid bath here, while leaving the 1095, which is in the Damascus, nice and black. And now you'll see the same thing here with just the ferric chloride. I'll show you in a sec. And you can do your entire acid etch just with ferric chloride, and usually you water it down a bit to get the desired look. But in this case, we're going to be using something a little bit more interesting to get some really nice deep blacks. There you can see our pattern. So there you can see our pattern. Now I'm just going to polish this blade up, and I'm going to repeat that process again, once, maybe twice. Generally the idea is you want to kind of be able to start to feel your Damascus pattern with the fingernail. So once you get to that point, we polish everything up nice and shiny, and then we'll go to our secondary acid bath, which I'll talk to about in a second. Alright, so 2 acid etches later, nice and polished again. And so the next step, in order to get our 1095 nice and black, to get that beautiful contrast so you can really see that Damascus pattern, we're going to be using instant coffee. Believe it or not, this will turn high carbon steel jet black as long as it has enough of that carbon content in there. Now again, the reason that we use 15 and 20 for one of our steels in a Damascus is because this will not turn the 15 and 20 black. Over time, it will tend to get darker, and that is because in the forge welding process,
enough of the carbon in the 15 and 20 and in the 1095 kind of get pulled into each other that you will start to get a little bit of dark on your 15 and 20 if you're not careful. So that's why when we put it in our solution here, you want to make sure you check it every hour or so and make sure that only your Damascus where you want it is getting black. And as soon as that 15 and 20 starts to darken, or as soon as you have a really good coating on your 1095 or 1084, you pull the knife and clean it off. So how much of this do we want to use? Well, general rule of thumb is you use about 1/3 of a container per mixture. Now you can usually do 2 or 3 knives out of one mixture before you lose your acidity and you start to not get as good of an acid etch on your steel. Now it's very important that you want to use distilled water or spring water, anything that's not tap water. So in tap water, they have put chlorine and fluoride in our tap water because we as Americans apparently can't take care of ourselves, so we need to have the government put nasty chemicals in our water to make sure that we're good and healthy, even though that's been illegal in like every other country. But hey, we live in America, right? So make sure you're using distilled water or spring water because that chloride and that fluorine in our tap water will actually neutralize our acid because both of those are bases. Now, basic chemistry, acids and bases want to neutralize, and we want our acidic coffee. Now, seeing what this does to blades, I will never drink instant coffee again, and honestly, I highly recommend to all of you watching, don't drink instant coffee, because if it turns steel jet black, whereas regular coffee does not, you can only imagine what it does to your insides. So that being said, I have my container here of instant coffee and water. Now, you can just do this cold, or you can bring your water up to a little bit above room temperature, maybe about 75 to 80 degrees, and that will kind of help your acid etch go a little bit faster. However, I just go with the cold substance and it works fine for me. It just takes a tiny bit longer. So again, make sure your steel is nice and cleaned off, no fingerprints or oils. Then we're just going to dip it in our instant coffee mixture here. And we're just going to let that sit for a couple hours. And like I said, you want to keep checking it every hour or so and see how it's doing. Make sure you're not over etching and getting a lot of black in your 15 and 20. So now we wait. So unfortunately, I let this knife sit in here for a little bit too long. My 15 and 20 started turning black on me. Now you could go through and clean this up, polish it back up and try again, but I think I'm going to leave it. I think it looks really, really cool, and it has that little extra layer of black, and I think it looks absolutely amazing. So sometimes accidents happen, and sometimes things are better because of it. So in this case, I think this looks better than if I were to shine it up and just leave that Damascus black. So we're going to go with it as it is. Finish up this blade, and I'll just show it off to you once everything is clear and good. But another tip for you before we finish this video off. After you have pulled your knife out of your instant coffee bath here, you want to let it sit for about maybe 10-15 seconds or so, and then run it under cold water. Let it sit for a little bit and then wipe it off. If you try and wipe it off right away as soon as you pull it out of your instant coffee, you will lose a lot of those black oxides and things will just turn brown and look gross. So you just want to be very careful, rinse off your instant coffee, and then wipe it down after a little bit of time to let those oxides really sit on your steel and really have something to grab onto. And if it's too brown and not black enough, just wash it off really good, make sure there's no grease or oil on there, and then just stick it back in your instant coffee bath and let it sit for a bit longer. And don't be like me and set yourself a timer and just keep checking it every hour or so. The warmer your instant coffee is when you start this process, the faster it goes. However, you don't want it hot, just warm, a little bit above room temperature. Or like me, you can just do it cold and it works just as good. Just takes a little bit longer. So there you have it. And like I said, I'll finish this knife off and show it off to you guys since I'm making it here in this video. But that's some tips and tricks for you guys as far as Damascus.